Good evening, everybody, and thank you for attending this very special event sponsored by the Socialist Project entitled Reinventing Work, Class Struggle, Workplaces, and the State, featuring Michael Yates. My name is Bryan Evans. I'm a member of the Socialist Project, and I'm employed at Toronto Metropolitan University, where I teach public administration, and I'll be chairing tonight. I'm going to make a few introductions, and be assured we have budgeted time at the very end for Q&A. So I want to begin by introducing Mike Yates, who is a longtime working class and labor educator, one of the editors of Monthly Review Press, a cornerstone independent socialist left publication for well over 60 years. Mike is not that old, I assure you. I am, but Mike is not. Mike is also the author of numerous books and articles, notably Can the Working Class Change the World? Naming the System, Inequality, and Work in the Global Economy, Why Unions Matter, among many others. We've organized a webinar featuring Mike Yates' latest book, a collection of his essays and new ones entitled Work, 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 Labor, Alienation, and Class Struggle. The book covers all kinds of aspects of work in capitalist society and how and why we need to move towards transforming and challenging that. In the introduction, he writes, to give you a flavor of the nature of the book, and I'm quoting here, "If we are ever to liberate ourselves, we must reinvent work, whether we will convert the daily hell that is work today into something that connects us to other people and the world around us, or will we descend into the alienation engulfing us?" For we at the Socialist Project, this is our own book launch, if you will, and we hope it leads for participants to read, learn, and engage in discussion and debate with others. It is clear that some of the recent struggles in Ontario, in the public sector in particular, very much referring to the partial political setback suffered by the Conservative government at the hands of 55,000 QP education workers, and supported broadly by the rest of the labor movement, and a very large part or largely understood movement by working people across Ontario. So in terms of proceeding, Mike will give a presentation. That will be followed by our two discussants who will address important themes in the book, and then we will open up to comments and questions for participants here. By way of introduction of our discussants, first of all, Herman Rosenfeld, who is a Toronto-based socialist activist, educator, and organizer, and writer with the Socialist Project. He is a retired national staff person with the Canadian Auto Workers, now Unifor, and he worked in their education department. Herman will be followed by Leanne McMillan, and Leanne retired only 2 years ago as a service representative for the Canadian Union of Public Employees. And 3 years ago, she was required to surrender her license to practice law, which is what they require you to do instead of simply retiring. I've worked with a lot of lawyers, and I didn't know you had to do that. She has been an activist for many years and remains a close watcher and analyst of the labor movement in particular, and the public sector in Canada and internationally. She has worked in Ontario and Atlantic Canada. She continues to try and learn Spanish and be a better parent and grandparent. So following the comments coming from Herman and Leanne, as I said earlier, I'll open the floor to Q&A, and we're hoping to finish in and around 8:30. So I'll turn it over to you, Michael.
Oh, thanks a lot. I appreciate it. Thanks to Socialist Project for inviting me to do this. It's a real honor. And I want to thank everybody like Herman, John McLennan, Brian, etc., that helped put this together in the first place. Anyway, let's get right down to it. I want to just talk about the book a little bit. I don't want to over talk. There's a lot of parts of the book, and best you read someone for yourself. But in any event, I want to start with what I think are some basic truths about work. First, I want to say that if you look at what the word work has meant in European languages, at least, the word work connotes notions of compulsion, affliction, torment, and persecution. That's pretty harsh if you think about it. But that seems to be a truth that's worth talking about. It's worth putting front and center in all discussions of work. The question is, well, why would that be so? Because for at least 95% of the time on Earth, of human time on Earth, work was not like that at all. I mean, there was no word for work really in such societies of gatherers and hunters, for example. And instead, work was a normal, natural part of life. It was the way in which humans interacted with the world around them to make both the means of production and to produce goods for use, to produce the basic necessities of life. And from what the anthropologists tell us, people in those societies had a great deal of what we today would call leisure time. So it wasn't like work consumed them as it does so many of us. Now the question is, well, what's different now? Well, without going into the way in which societies have transformed into capitalism, we know that in capitalism, work is something altogether different than that. We don't produce for use at all. We produce for the market. And what distinguishes capitalism from previous modes of production is that labor has become a commodity. It's something that's simply bought and sold in the marketplace and subject to the vagaries of that marketplace. And those who buy our labor, our ability to work, they consider it to be their property for the time that we're working. And that has important implications for what follows. Well, the question then becomes, well, what is it about capitalism? Labor is a commodity. Why is it a commodity? Well, obviously it's a commodity because the means of production, which we all have to have access to if we're to live, are owned by a small minority of persons. And that means that the rest of us have little choice but to sell the one thing that we do have, which is our capacity to work to them. Now, what do they have in mind? Well, they have in mind something pretty basic and obvious. They want to make money. They want to make as much profit as they can, and they want to grow as much as they can, endlessly. Capitalism is noted by an endless drive to growth, to accumulate capital, as Marx said. Well, given that that's what the capitalists want, how do they get it? Well, it seems to me that there are two things that they must do to make that profit and to grow. They must exploit us. They must exploit workers. They must generate a surplus from our labor. Otherwise, they wouldn't make any profit and they wouldn't be able to grow. Now, along with that exploitation comes expropriation. In the first place, they had to get a hold of the commons. They had to get a hold of land and materials and so on and so forth. So they expropriated them. They took them by main force for the most part. So the combination of exploitation and expropriation, that's two of the things that they must do. But they must do something further, it seems to me, because human beings don't think of themselves as commodities. They don't think of themselves as objects to be bought and sold. They don't think of themselves as mere costs of production. And so they resist being treated as commodities. And if you think about workplaces, the only active element really are the workers. They're the only people that can throw a monkey wrench in things. Now, to prevent that from happening, one of the concepts that I use in the book is that workers must be controlled. Just like machines are controlled, workers must be controlled. Now, they're a possibly recalcitrant element in production, so control takes many forms. And one of the things that I describe in the book are all the different types of control that capital employs to control the workers, so that we behave in such a way so that a given amount of our labor power, when combined with machinery and equipment and buildings and land, will generate X amount of output. Okay, that's the way, that's what the capitalists want. So they have to exert maximum control over us. In the book, I outline all different kinds of controls. Initially, forms of control take the form of centralizing workers into workplaces, so they no longer work in their homes, where they have control over at least some of the means of production. In addition, once our labor was centralized into factories, for example, then we can be observed. And one of the outcomes of that observation was to see that workers often divided their own labor into component parts so that they could produce more in a given amount of time, so that they could work more quickly. And it was a short step for capital to decide that the subtasks that a given worker utilized all the time anyway could be doled out to different people. Initially, women who had been denied craft work could be employed. Children could be employed, often orphans, for example, as the division of labor, the detailed division of labor, became a control mechanism. It made workers more easily replaced, for example. It created a pool of people, a much greater pool of people that could do any given job. And then it became obvious to those who observed, to capital's hired hands, to their managers, that perhaps mechanization could replace some of those subtasks, especially when we got independent power sources like water power or coal. Then the machinery itself could be a powerful control mechanism. In addition, as other people have observed, mechanization itself helps to simplify work. It helps to reduce the amount of skill that's necessary for any given task as well. Okay, so those were early forms of control. The great guru of management, Frederick Taylor, then took what was done before, those forms of control, and he systematized those. And his main goal was to make sure that the conceptualization of work, that is how the work was to be done, would be in the hands of the management, period, and the workers would have no say about that. So with his time study experts, who unfortunately, my grandfather was one of those in the factory where my father worked, they watched what the workers did with their stopwatches, and they looked at the motions that the workers made, and then they re-engineered those motions and those times and dictated that the work should be performed in specific ways, invariably. And that three-part system of tailorization of work took hold, and it's still a foundation of all capitalist production, it seems to me. Okay. Then later, mainly through the Toyota Automobile Corporation, we get what I'm sure you're all familiar with, lean production, which is essentially an extension and deepening of Taylorism. And lean production has many component parts. Systematic hiring, for example, where metadata is used to hire people who will be most amenable to control, who will be most identifying with the employer rather than with one another. In addition to systematic hiring, you have the famous team production, where workers are put into teams and then they're cross-trained, which is another way of saying that when one worker is short, another worker can do two tasks instead of one, two subtasks. It's not really skilling the workers in any way. You have the famous just-in-time inventory, and that's applied to workers now, where where materials are supplied just in time. I'm sure those of you familiar with the auto industry know all about that, where you have peripheral plants and then sub-peripheral plants supplying parts just in time. Okay, then you have what the Japanese call Kaizen, the constant improvement, the constant speed up of work. And workers are expected as teams to solve whatever problems might occur. So if the assembly line is sped up, or if there are not enough materials available, or if a person's short, or if one person's taken away from a team, then the rest of the team members are expected to take up the slack. So the long and short of it is that the workers are under constant stress, under constant strain, under constant pressure to get the job done. I even read about an auto plant in Indiana, I believe it was a Subaru Isuzu plant, where workers were trained to time study themselves. And some of them thought that was a great thing to know, that they were somehow being taught a skill, whereas really they were being taught to speed themselves up in the workplace. Okay. And now, of course, another part of lean production is the insidious surveillance of workers. That's what I call the panopticon in chapter 5 of my book. And these have reached incredible heights, as you can see in an Amazon warehouse, for example, where workers are monitored. A person that I know that works in a Whole Foods said there may be as many as 50 cameras in the place, watching workers at all times. It's hard to get a minute of peace, a minute of privacy, a second of privacy, a millisecond of privacy. So workers are surveilled at all times. And in fact, customers are brought into the surveillance. I mean, what else could you call but how you're supposed to rate your professors in colleges, or how you're supposed to rate your stay at a hotel and say who deserved credit and who deserved to be, who wasn't a good worker. So consumers are part of that surveillance of workers as well, making it especially sort of devious. And in addition to these control mechanisms that occur inside the workplace, outside of the workplace, we should never forget that one of the most important forms of control historically and even today is main force by the employers, force and potential violence. This violence takes all kinds of forms. Private entities historically have done some of that. I was born in a coal mining town in Pennsylvania where they had state-sanctioned coal and iron police keeping law and order in the town. When the miners got out of hand in that town, then the coal and iron police would be there to crack them on the head. And then, of course, you have you have regular police. The military in the United States, for example, has broke many a strike. So we want to think about those mechanisms outside of the workplaces as well as control mechanisms. And if you think about most of the institutions in society, aren't they sort of peripheral, but they're sort of central in a way, control mechanisms? What is schooling, for example, but a control mechanism? Teaching you to be obedient, teaching you to take orders, teaching you to be a good worker, teaching you to someday get your foot in the door in a workplace and rise up the ladder of success. What's the law but a control mechanism? Barring actions by, consolidated collective actions by the working class, the law is always going to operate as a control mechanism. The labor laws in the United States, and I'm sure in Canada and lots of other places, leave a whole lot to be desired in terms of workers' rights. They serve as a powerful control mechanism. The state itself is a powerful control mechanism because, of course, it's the state that makes the laws. And it's the state that does a whole pile of other things as well. So in any event, these control mechanisms are central to what I have to say in the book. And I give a lot of examples of what the outcomes of these are. Because I have a chapter 3, it's called Work is Hell. And the end result of the exploitation, the expropriation, these control mechanisms that are necessary so that capital can accumulate, so that capital can make money and grow endlessly, is that fact that work is hell. And especially if we look around the world, if we look to the global south, and even in the rich countries. I once worked for the United Farm Workers Union, and I can tell you that farm work, before the union came along, the United Farm Workers work was surely hell. Of course, that union went into decline, as I describe in another chapter in the book, and work is still hell for those farm workers. Look all around the world. I think there are about 860 million farm workers in the world. Their work is all hell for the most part. I once read an interesting thing. In India, there are 5 million, mostly women, that make cheap cigars and cigarettes in their homes and in sweatshops. Surely their work is hell. There are all kinds of child laborers in the world. Their work is hell. There are all kinds of what we call independent contractors in the United States, but people that are engaged in hideous forms of employment in every country in the global south and in some of the rich countries as well. And it's also, there's a profound alienation as the consequence of all of this control, of all of this exploitation and expropriation. It's the alienation that takes many forms. Alienation from our fellow workers who are our competitors rather than our companions, rather than our comrades. It's an alienation from the things that we make. It's not ours, it's sold. We have nothing to say about it once it leaves our hands. Okay. There's alienation within ourselves. There's the work Michael and there's the not work Michael. And that's true for all of us. What did we used to say before work was a 24/7 proposition? Thank God it's Friday, because we got the weekend to be human beings. In the workplace, that's not the case. And finally, we're alienated from the natural world around us. The result of which, that through our labors, the environment itself is being destroyed. And one of the things that's struck me is that surely the environment is a working class issue. I've been reading a lot of articles about heat and how there are places in the world where it's not going to be possible to work outside anymore. Phoenix, Arizona, for example, the countries in the Middle East, where temperatures routinely reach 115 degrees and the heat index is even higher than that. Human beings can't work in places like that. So if you think about construction workers and every worker that works outside, sooner or later, it's not going to be possible. If you look at the effects of the environment, they always affect working class people, poor people, more than they do rich people. So through our labors, we're actually destroying the metabolism of our relationship to the natural world and the metabolism of the earth itself. Okay. Now, those are the consequences. I have many examples. Now, before I stop, and I hope I haven't taken up too much time, then the question is, well, what should we do about these things? And it strikes me that since work is so central, that it's through work that capitalism can do what it does. Without workers, there are no profits. There is no capitalism without our labor power. It seems to me that we have to try to strive for a world where we can't use words like compulsion to describe something so basic to human existence as work. We can't use words like persecution. We can't use words like affliction to describe our work. We have to create a world in which work can't be described in those ways, where work is once again a normal and natural state of being, where we produce things for our own use and for the good of society. Now, how do we go about doing that? Well, I'm sure some of you can tell a lot more about this than I can. But what I can say is that we have to make the discussion of work central to all of our organizing and to every organization and institution of which we are a part. And I think that these organizations and institutions have to have certain characteristics. I think they have to have a set of radical principles based upon notions of equality in as many dimensions of life as possible, based upon conceptions of human rights. That is, we have rights as human beings to live happy lives, to live unalienated lives. So every institution has to have that. And in addition to which, I think it's critically important that every institution have a radical education component in which these issues, which these obvious, to me, obvious truths that I presented are front and center in discussions. Some unions do, not many unions in the United States, for example, do any education at all. But the education that they do is more or less practical education, and that's good. You know, you have to teach workers about how to file grievances, and you have to teach workers about how to run meetings and things like that. But workers have to be taught more things than that. Working people have to be taught the nature of the system itself, what it is, what it means, what work is, what it means, how work is controlled, and so on and so forth. So I think radical education is absolutely critical. Now, we can start in any organization. For example, in collective bargaining, it's very simple to attack management control in some ways. You've got to do your best to get rid of those ridiculous management rights clauses that are in so many contracts. You have to have shortened grievance procedures. You have to have a right to strike over many issues. You can't restrict the right to strike. Work itself, you have to have people specially trained so that they know about these control mechanisms, so they can anticipate them when they might occur, so they can prepare workers for what's going to happen to them. Same thing's true with any organizing that you do in workplaces. Now, in addition, I'm not going to sit here and say that political action isn't necessary, because after all, even though the state is a control mechanism, if you have any semblance of democracy, certain pressures can be put on the state. And whatever pressures can be put on the state to attack managerial control, to attack exploitation and expropriation, they should be done. I'm sure you have many examples yourself, but certainly that has to be done. Now, I like the motto of the landless workers movement in Brazil: occupy, resist, produce. I think those are all good things. You know, unions in the United States have built their own hospitals. They built their own housing developments. They built vacation places for workers. There's no reason why unions can't do those things. The United Auto Workers in the United States has a strike fund of about $1 billion now. They finally raised the weekly strike benefit for those teachers out, those education workers out in California are getting a little bit more money per week than they used to get, because the United Auto Workers has a lot of those people organized. But unions have a lot of resources, rich unions anyway, in the United States. Money could be put to bear to support worker centers, for example, of which there are many in the United States that do a lot of good things that operate more on a more general level than just about specific workplace demands. So I'm all for that sort of thing too. Certainly working people have to start thinking about producing things. They have to think about utilizing abandoned factories and abandoned places for production of goods for social use. So there are lots of things that can be done, and perhaps in the discussion that follows and what other people have to say, we can get into some of those things. But anyway, the book has a lot of things in it. I can't begin to discuss them all in a very short period of time, but those are some of the thoughts that I had. Certain basic truths, what the outcomes of those basic truths, the implementation of what capital does, what that means to human beings, nothing good, I can assure you, and what we might do about it. And there's no hope really unless there's collective action. I mean, we all know that's the truth. How to make that work, that's a lot more complicated thing, but we do know what has to be done, I think. This is just a question of trying to figure out ways to get it done. Okay, well, let me just stop right there and hope I haven't taken up too much time.
Yeah, that's wonderful, Michael. Thank you very much. Yeah, bravo. That's great. Now, let me turn it over to Herman Rosenfeld.
That's wonderful. I just wanted to start by thanking George Hewison and John McLennan for starting this process. I see you're here. Thanks. I want to address three areas. One, not much, because Mike basically did it, about the importance of addressing work in this book. Secondly, some comments on the nature of trade unions, what they are now, their potential, some of the things we need to transform them, and in particular, their approach to the issues that Mike raised, particularly around work. And third, elements of working class politics, which are addressed in this book and implied in what Mike was saying around class, party, social democracy, and some of the things that we as our socialists can and might do. And basically, as Mike spoke, this book addresses the degradation of work in capitalism, and it's a critical pillar of this book and runs like a thread throughout the whole thing. And even at the end of the book, there's a kind of Mike has this postface, which gives it a flavor of what an alternative work might be. It's what happened for a very short time in the early 1980s, late 1970s in Volvo's Uddevalla plant in Sweden, where as a result of high employment, high absenteeism, strong unions, a strong pro-labor government, and the relative inability of the capitalists to move at the time, was before neoliberalism really took hold, that I've seen videos of workers collectively building an entire vehicle from beginning to the end, working together, and it's a different model. And the fact that it is possible to do things differently, even though that didn't take hold, because when Volvo was able to move, and when it was able to, when it was taken over by other companies, that disappeared, and lean production and it became hegemonic in production. I just want to say that here that any attempt to fight for an alternative social system to capitalism must have an alternative view and vision of the nature of work, and challenge work intensity, control, and the elements of lean production that Mike talked about, which are ubiquitous everywhere, and the selling the ideology of competitiveness, which underlies it. They need to be part of not just long-term goals of transformation, but current program of reforms, and integrated into union organizing and collective bargaining, not just the subject of bargaining, but also the subject of the kind of collective resistance that needs to take place in workplaces, in unions. The refusal, I want to move on a little bit just to talk about trade unions now, because the refusal of trade unions to actually work to transform work as part of their challenge to employers is a critical indictment of unions today, particularly their weakness. And the best of them have a kind of moderate defensive framework where they have some experts who who study the time to the best that they can, the so-called scientific, now it's almost totally computerized methods of breaking down work through production standards, grievances, and the like. And it really is very ineffective, and it's interesting. It's not just because they don't know how to do it. It reflects a lot of the defeat that the trade unions have suffered under neoliberalism. Obviously, unions are key working class institutions, but they're dramatically weakened by the decades of neoliberalism, the defeat of the socialist left as a reference point, and as people within the different locals and unions provide an alternative way to look at things. The collaborative acceptance of progressive competitiveness and the need to help the private sector bosses compete and public sector employers save tax money, become more efficient, and become more like the private sector. They have been all too common amongst union leaders, secondary leadership, as well as much as the rank and file. This is not because of evil union leadership. It becomes hegemonic in the way people think. Acceptance of the need to increase productivity as a competitive necessity and as a basis for higher wages, and defending what exists, and certainly in North America, the private welfare state benefits, have led unions away from challenging work intensity. Clearly, this is one of the problems of unions in this era, not to mention the acceptance of multi-tiering in workforces, the falling behind of wages to inflation, the giving up, the loss of elements of this private welfare state, like defined benefit pension plans and the like. And this is now matched by the difficult efforts of public sector unions in dealing with the attack on their pensions. There have been almost no real criticisms or programmatic efforts of workplace bargaining challenges from the union movement against lean production in this period or its principal effect on workers. That was different in the 80s and 90s. In auto, when I was in the Canadian Auto Workers, we had a whole series of educational work we did with workers. There was all kinds of efforts to try and forestall this and to challenge employers. And you had various public sector workers like the Alberta nurses who fought tremendously against what they call total quality management. And around the world, you had various efforts to try and challenge this. But in this era of the late neoliberalism, that's disappeared. Unions remain critical for working class lives, potentials, and even the most basic components of class identification. But the generational defeat of unions, the radical loss of density in the private sector, doesn't just come from attacks on unions by employers and governments, and the reduction of the social safety net that increased the dependency of workers and the market success of employers. They come from unions' unwillingness and inability to take on employers, building a base of member confidence, understanding and militancy, concerns with organizing, all too often to buttress the finances of their own organizations, rather than collective efforts, lack of strategic focus, and the destruction of a socialist and radical left that had influenced education, organization, and indeed the building of the union movement in past generations. And Mike places emphasis on a necessary transformation of the union movement, as opposed to union bashing and categorizing all leadership as bureaucracy, along with the building alternative working class institutions in communities to supplement unions and workplaces. The kind of transformations needed to reflect the general approach that Joe Burns described in his book, Class Struggle Unionism, based on an acceptance of the incompatibility of interests between working class and capital, building democracy, education, and approach to class struggle. More than militancy, but collective forms of struggle and mobilization, starting in the workplace, building workers' understanding of their employers, workers, and the system as a whole, as Mike just described, and contributing to the building of approaches that engage the entire class, which is another component of this. Because the working class is more than a group of workers at a given employer or sector who are represented by a given union. And this is a major structural weakness of unions and can only be overcome by how they operate, strategize, and collectively struggle. For example, in the private sector, do they challenge and can they challenge their employer's strategic goals, what they produce and for whom? In particular, if you look at the environmental challenge, that's a big deal. Do they fight against the existence of different wage scales for different generations of workers doing the same jobs at the same time, which is a feature certainly in the auto industry? Do they challenge workloads in the ideology of competitiveness? Do they fight against forms of gig working and helping to organize gig workers as a whole? Do they work together to organize entire new sectors, not in order to get new members for each of them, but as a crusade to build a working class? Do they fight for state-delivered social benefits, free dental care, Medicare for all, improved public pensions? How engaged are they in class battles like the fight for healthcare, education, and the workers in those sectors if they come from the private sector? Public and cooperative housing, the rights of renters. In the public sector, the users of public services are critical allies. Are they engaged? In the public sector, do they build common fronts across sectors? And in struggles like the one we just saw, where there was a partial victory here in the battle against the conservative Ford government's effort to outlaw striking and use this ridiculous component of the Constitution called the Notwithstanding Clause, and impoverished workers. This victory came in many ways through an intensive organizing and education that took place in the Canadian Union Public Employers Union that led the battle, and I think Leanne's going to talk about some of that. Intentional internal organizing efforts to build leadership, and that means to build leadership out of the rank and file, find out members' concerns, explaining the need to build, testing out levels of support, making corrections, ongoing discussion and debate, and even a basic modicum of political education. This was carried out in some of these locals, and it's pretty amazing to see the result. The class building orientation mentioned above doesn't come with a progressive leader calling for it, although progressive leaders have to play a role, but by building understanding and support from the rank and file and what we call secondary leadership. That doesn't happen by itself, but through education and campaigning with the base. And then there we had a threat of a general strike of some sort as part of the mobilization against Ford. But by doing that is not something that is that easily willed, either through honest efforts or non-honest efforts by leaders. It too has to be built, albeit being an excellent tactic. It's only a tactic, although a powerful one, which has all kinds of components to it. But as we saw in the Ontario Days of Action, I can't go into that too much. It involves like assessing where you can do, what you can do, where you can do, what kind of education you need to have. Is the union movement going to define what happens in each of these communities, or does it have to have a partnership with working class organizing in communities? And that's part of what the Ontario Days of Action did. And they had teams of workers throughout from both the communities and unions that went into the different communities and did a lot of education work. They actually held, I know the CAW had in London, they held union meetings where they had votes about whether or not people, many of whom had voted for the Conservatives in the first place, would agree to strike their employer in the name of fighting what they're doing in solidarity with other working class people who were affected. And it took a while to do that. The type of education and mobilizational approach we saw in small doses last month is an initial step in opening up spaces in unions for building and transforming them. Sometimes it comes from a willing leadership and an activist core, and that's what you had in this instance. At other times, you got to organize oppositional groups and caucuses, like some of the teachers' unions in the US. Unions are key working class organizations, and they can be centers of struggle, but the everyday workplace lives of workers are clearly more complex than that. And how to integrate the bitter struggle orientation and the needs with the everyday world of workplaces remains an ongoing challenge. And of course, the working class is bigger than the minority of workers who are in unions. But unions can also serve as spaces for education about the system, about class, about working class potentials. And as Mike said, that is a central component. The final thing I want to talk about is about politics. Mike, in his book, is justly critical of the social democratic orientation of the dominant voices coming from the Democratic Socialists of America, which in fairness has a lot of disparate voices coming from them. It's that kind of a space. It's sort of depressing to see many of the young and very energetic and creative American activists who consider themselves to be socialists identify with the problematic conception of social transformation. That somehow, and Mike identifies this in his book, I think quite well, that somehow sees an accumulation of some very ambitious reforms, somehow adding up to an alternative to capitalism. Whether in the US, where there is no social democratic party per se, although components of the Democrats are, or Canada and other global North capitalist parliamentary democracies where there are, their critique of social democracy is a central element of developing a working class politics can eventually challenge the capitalist system, even though social democrats will often be our allies and need to be, and we need to work in an alliance with them. Reforms, no matter how radical, like nationalizing the financial system, or non-radical, but seemingly radical in the context of neoliberalism, like Medicare for all in the US, limiting capital mobility, or even full pharmacare here, will always be limited and challenged by the power of capital to invest. And our collective dependence on private profits and accumulation for economic activity, and even for the funds to pay for the social wage, not to mention attempting to limit the scope, universality, and the survival of those reforms, are all basically affected by capital. Social democracy, for the most part, has given up on promising a road out of capitalism, in spite of the illusions of some of its more radical young practitioners, who seem to have missed the historical trajectories of earlier versions of the idea of the accumulation of reforms, getting rid of capitalism, which were held by ideologists and by a lot of people in Sweden and elsewhere. They didn't work. Whatever their illusions, they, as I said, they're certainly our allies. Yates calls for the creation of democratic working class parties, and this vision doesn't look like the proverbial labor parties, which are mired in a laborist ideology or social democracy, either of the third way or other forms. What socialist or class parties would look like or how they might be built is not all that clear in the world. Mike makes a stab at some of the roads in that direction, and that's really an important component of the book. At the very least, there's an acknowledgement of the need not to be mired in traditional visions of social democracy or political instruments repeating the historical mistakes and limitations of that dead end, particularly at this moment. Whether that includes tactical use of democratic primaries or not, or working in the NDP, it's difficult as well to see the Democratic Party or the NDP as any real vehicle for building towards socialist politics or the kind of changes needed to move in that direction. There's little about it in the book, but the inference is clear. On the other hand, there's no dismissal here of electoral politics itself, which has to be a critical component of working class politics, although its relationship to on-the-ground building isn't all that clear. And quite honestly, it isn't all that clear to any of us. But there are a number of references to various forms of collective resistance that played an important role in challenging elements of the political consensus in the US and similarly in Canada. That is Occupy, Black Lives Matter, Operation Solidarity in BC, which some of you were part, I know some of you were part in leadership of that, the Days of Action, the Alter Globalization, Chicago Teachers, that sort of thing. And also this interesting political experiment in Richmond, California, as well as various forms of social experimentation, such as worker cooperatives, like the network built in Jackson, Mississippi. Aside from being forms of collective resistance and social experimentation and ways of addressing needs for working class people, there are two potential limitations with this. One is that worker participation in these key struggles and movements don't automatically lead to learning critical lessons. There has to be education around that when that happens. And secondly, that figurative experiences that also have like things like worker co-ops don't necessarily take people the same lesson. The rich social network of cooperatives and worker services that communists and social democrats had in Europe in the 30s and 40s in the 30s and early 40s were really important. But this is not really what we're seeing here, because what we're looking at here is a lot of these movements are not tied to a long-term vision of transforming capitalism. In other words, there isn't a socialist political movement that's tied to these experiments. So it limits what happens there. Without this kind of a movement or movements, working within class communities, institutions are a set of economic experiments. Workers don't necessarily learn the radical conclusions, and the movements don't necessarily build the way we'd like them to. Aside from the almost inevitable suffocation of worker co-op commercial ventures over time, to the requirements of surviving in a capitalist economy, competition, cost reduction, financing. On the other hand, the rather limited structural effects of some of those wonderful political movements we've seen, we don't see much of resonance of them. The critical factor that's missing is the existence and presence of organized socialist educational resources and the complementary presence of a movement to tie these initiatives to a larger project of challenging capitalism while organizing with working people in these kind of environments. Socialists need to be present to help strategize, organize in, and later summarize with other participants the experiences and lessons of what we can learn. Workers, like anyone else, learn different lessons from common experiences, and they can easily draw conservatizing, cynical, or highly idiosyncratic conclusions. Think of those who participated in the Ontario Days of Action, who from some of the community experience, who think that unions were only in there to take advantage of this, or people who figured that, well, even though we had general strikes, we can't make change. Similar so in terms of people participating in Occupy, anti-globalization movement, and Black Lives Matter. What was built out of those experiences? What political forces were missing to help build them further? Who took advantage of this? And similarly, with various cooperative experimentation, have they been tied to larger political and social movements towards socialism? I'm almost finished. And even with current union struggles, the best of them, what we have seen in Ontario, the US teacher strikes, and one could add the inspiring transportation and soon to be nurses strikes in the UK. Who is working to do more in-depth political education with the workers, as well as the necessary union building work that has been exemplary in CUPE and Chicago? An element of all of this is the necessity of creating a sense of class from a disparate components of the working class majorities in Canada, the US, and elsewhere. With the decline of the specific weight of the manufacturing and industrial component of the working class and the huge gulf between different strata of the working class, can just list them about employed, unemployed, blue collar, white collar, racial divides, and gender divides, gig versus steadily employed, resources versus others, workers who are renters versus workers who are homeowners. All of these things are divisions within the working class which need to be overcome and built. And it's not to mention the need to win over the working class components to the need to move off fossil fuels and the fascination with individual mobile transport, which seems to be the way out of this unfortunately in the auto union. The working class that Mike describes doesn't operate as a class and doesn't recognize itself as a class. It must be built by common struggle, solidaristic struggles like students, parents supporting teachers, medical workers and patients working with and patients' families, support for rentals, environmental movements like Green Jobs Oshawa, and education. But what is missing really is any kind of socialist presence inside and outside political and working class institutions such as unions. Party building has to come out of that, but that is what we need. I call it building socialist understanding through education, collective struggle, and creating a socialist presence in key working class spaces. And clearly electoral politics will come out of this. So that's my take on this.
Thank you very much, Herman. I really appreciated your insights. I'd like to invite Leanne McMillan to take the floor.
I think you're gonna, when I talk, you're gonna think you're in a different meeting. I wanted to thank Herman and Mike and Herman and Mike for their remarks. And I wanted to start where I agree with Mike that we should reinvent work. And my remarks are focusing on why we should reinvent bargaining as a very small part of that. I was asked to speak about the recent Canadian Union of Public Employees School Board bargaining, and so I'm not really going to respond to anything that Herman or Mike addressed, and I'm sorry if I might have got into the weeds a little bit too much on the details of it. When I was preparing my remarks, I read 4 articles, and I called Herman and I said, oh my gosh, I think people are going to think I was plagiarizing from the articles I read. And then I said, well, I'm retired. I'm not subject to academic penalties, so I'm not going to worry about that anymore. And my thoughts are my own, but I'm really closely lined up with Herman and Sam Ginden, who's not on the call, and of course my loving professor of law, Harry Glassbeck, who's on the call. So Matt's going to put up some of the articles as just so that you can see what you responded, but mostly I want to make sure that I thought these things before I read all their articles. So because I was a labor and employment law for 28 years, I approached lived experience in reality by looking at the legal relations which developed out of the economic conditions. So naturally, for me, when I started thinking about this topic, I started with the 1867 Constitution Act, which was normally called the British North American Act. And it's separated the governmental powers between our nascent federal government and the provincial legislative assemblies. And as we moved into 1982, to the Canadian Constitution, we still continued to move around the existing economic and constitutional provisions to deal with work. So trust me, my 1867 Act stuff does affect bargaining even now. So each province has its own labor and employment legislation in all the areas of its jurisdiction, like education, healthcare, social services. But because of the compromise that developed Canada in 1867, based on the defeat of the French colonial power of the Plains of Abraham in 1759, French-speaking people weren't eliminated in Lower Canada or in Eastern Canada, and we had different school systems set up based on religion and language. And what that means to us in 2022 in Ontario is that you have at least 4 different school boards in many communities: English, French, public, Catholic. And because you have different rules of labor legislation in each province, you have a complicated system of establishing bargaining rights by a process of applying for certification for an appropriate bargaining unit that's approved by an administrative tribunal called the Labor Relations Board, which is approved by a majority vote, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the process of negotiating collective agreements is also highly regulated, as is the process of resolving workplace disputes through a grievance and arbitration process while the collective agreement is still in place. It means that there's no more strikes for union recognition in exchange for things like automatic dues deductions. And it means no more sit-down strikes to deal with a violation of a collective agreement or the firing of a coworker while the collective agreement is in effect. And I'd urge you to look out to Harry Glassbeek's November 8th article in Canadian Dimension, where he provides a comprehensive overview of how labor legislation has adopted to 21st century capitalism in his article called CUPE, Class Struggle and the Charter. So all this history means that the workers that were employed by the various school boards in Ontario can be members of the Canadian Union of Public Employees, but they can also be members of any of the various teachers' unions, even something like Ontario Secondary School Teachers Federation. They might represent teachers, but in a very separate bargaining unit, they'll also represent administrative workers, and in another bargaining unit may represent custodians and cleaners. But they will all have separate collective agreements and will often have separate dates for when they're actually permitted to bargain. OPSU is also representing people in the school boards here. And in Ottawa, a relative of mine works in an administrative position for the Catholic School Board and is in a CUPE local. Her friend is a custodian who's in a Unite Here local. Like, who knew Unite Here was representing school board workers? And then another relative was in a non-unionized sector because nobody's bothered to organize them for decades or whatever. But at least they were all employed by the same school board. And just multiply that by 3 separate school boards, additional ones in Ontario. So you have CUPE representing 55,000 workers in 4 school boards across the province, but not in every school, not in every community, and certainly doesn't have wall-to-wall representation of everybody who shows up to work for a school board. So trying to take on the state and employers in a situation where you have 2 hands tied against your back is a really difficult situation. So I wanted, when I talk about reinventing bargaining, I am going to talk to you about how CUPE members organize differently this round of bargaining, but I also want to give you things that you already know about, but 2 examples where other groups of workers have reinvented bargaining, or at least done it differently. So the province right next to us, Quebec, I really think that we need to get rid of our 2 solitudes and learn more about what actually happens on the ground for workers there. They have different provincial labor legislation, which is, despite decades of neoliberal attacks by their own bourgeoisie, still has many provisions which give some modicum of support to workers. And the unions in that province have a long history of working together in what they call common fronts to negotiate, even if they're voluntary and even if they're non-binding. Nevertheless, the provincial government in Quebec knows that it is dealing, for example, now with the 4 largest public sector unions, CSN, FTQ, CSQ, and APTS, about wages. So in April of this year, the 4 unions announced that they would be making common wage demands for collective agreements that don't even expire until next March 31st. And as of November of this year, they already tabled their comprehensive economic demands, and it's one package for all of those bargaining units representing 250,000 workers. There's no tiny little bargaining unit somewhere in Ottawa representing 100 workers that's going up against the state. This is a way that you potentially have maybe one hand behind your back. In New Brunswick, just a year ago, we had another way of organizing things by province-wide bargaining. And in some cases, in this case, hold on for it, a 16-day provincial-wide strike. Because of the peculiarities of organizing in New Brunswick, CUPE actually represents many, many, many more employees employed directly by the provincial government than you would have in the province of Ontario. They have a much, much, much larger presence. And because of that, they represent 30,000 members. Like, just think about it. CUPE in Ontario had 55,000 in our whole province. CUPE New Brunswick has 30,000 in a much, much, much smaller program. And it's province, and it's healthcare, education, municipalities, universities, social services, liquor stores are all part of this. And they bargained with bargaining councils, not just local by local, or bargaining unit by bargaining unit. And they spent the previous 3 years before they started bargaining, making sure that 22,000 of their members out of the 30,000 that they represent were bargaining together to try to break the mandate, bargain forward. Premier Higgs wanted to have a wage freeze and then a further 3 years of a 1% each year. And they said, not this time. They ended up having, as I said, a 16-day strike. That was almost a general strike in the province. It didn't include the private sector, but in terms of people who were across all of those sectors, that's where they were. They had intensive community interactions for months and months before of this. You can't organize this just in a weekend. Parades, town fairs, wherever you want to do it, CUPE members were there with their message and their van. And the province didn't legislate them back to work even after 16 days, even though they're providing these things. Now, part of that is because New Brunswick has horrible essential services legislation for workers, and it allows many parts of the public service to function. And we used to laugh about better staffing during a strike than during a regular weekend shift in a hospital. They would really make sure that you had to have it fully staffed and the other people were out on the picket line. But the end of this 16-day was that the province and the CUPE locals reached a tentative agreement voluntarily that had economic increases of 2% plus a flat 25-cent increase for everybody on the start of every year of the 4-year contract. Most workers in that thing were making $21.50 an hour. So the 25 cents an hour flat on top of the 2% represented more than 1% for everybody who's actually in the bargaining unit. And they also were required to make casual employees get the actual dollar for dollar amount of the work of a full-time, part-time employee. Prior to that, they were getting 80% on the dollar for everybody else that worked. And so all of the sectors but one, they had, the other thing they did, they have 7 that deal directly with the province, and the other 4 sectors, the province agreed to fund the exact same settlement so that all 22,000 members were going to be covered by this agreement that was bargained. And this is all being done last October before the incredible amounts of inflation. So you might be saying, well, this is horrible. They only got 15% over 4 years. But because they were so delayed, many of these workers will be back to the bargaining table already because they were dealing with contracts that had already expired for 3 or 4 years. So they're going to be back to the table soon. Your it's still I'm not in any way shouting out to the province of New Brunswick for their labor laws. They've got horribly regressive things. But CUPE itself, with material conditions that means that they almost have wall to wall for everything, was able to actually transform their members in a way of one for one, all for all. We're going to do this together. Nobody settles unless we all get a deal. Like exactly what we should be wanting to do it. So we're back in Ontario. What did CUPE do that was different this year? So please understand, I retired 2 years ago. I was never employed with anybody in the education sector. Everything that I'm talking to you for tonight was reading every Facebook post, every bargaining bulletin, and I tried to follow the news. And I'm hoping that some graduate student somewhere takes this on as a comprehensive project, because there's just a mine of information here about how to do it. So they're the backbone, and they describe themselves as the backbone of the education system. They're not teachers. The educational assistants, custodians, school library workers, early childhood educators, nutrition services, school safety monitors, everybody who's not a teacher there. So how is it bargaining different this year? For one thing, in 2014, the province created a new piece of legislation specifically for the school boards, Collective Bargaining Act, and it mirrors very, very unique, almost verbatim what the Labor Relations Act has in the province. So why did they replicate all of that? Well, what they wanted to do in part was codify what had previously been a voluntary practice for CUPE locals coming together in a school board council. So some local could opt out. So now they can't. If you've been certified as a school board council, that's where you are going to be, although there is a provision for relinquishing a council. And then it has a whole bunch of other stuff with it, which I'm going to do. Now, why did that come? Well, because in 2012, there was a horrible round of bargaining, which ended in an imposed contract and a wage through Bill 115. That was ultimately ruled unconstitutional in 2016 by an Ontario Superior Court. And the government at that time did not appeal the court decision. And CUPE and the provincial government negotiated a financial remedy for the breach of the charter and the right of freedom of association, which was still subject to ratification by the members. And that was $56 million in back pay. Other unions like OPSU and teachers negotiated similar amounts, but obviously for the teachers, it would have been bigger and bigger and bigger. So you have a provincial government who's going, okay, well, when we legislate them back to work and we have to impose a contract, we're going to have to pay it back. We got to deal with that. The next round of bargaining, you have Bill 124, which had every collective agreement has to have a modifier, a period of 3 years. Nobody can get total compensation more than 1%. So it wasn't just wages, it was the whole everything. You couldn't increase bereavement days, you couldn't increase sick pay days if that meant that your total of 1% was gone. Health contributions were excluded because you have to protect the insurance agency. They obviously want to get their premiums more than 1%. So here we were in 2022. We're going to have free collective bargaining, free out of Bill 124 for the school boards, and you've got the council able to bargain. Number two, CUPE decided that it was going to take the lead in bargaining rather than waiting for the teachers union. There's a hierarchy in these things, and you let the big person go first. They said, no, not this time. We're going to go first. They also decided, number three, the biggest important thing is that they were going to basically go back to the future. They were going to use the organizing methods of mobilizing union members that have been amplified by people like Jane McElvey and the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, and they are organizing for power sessions. They've offered them for 80 countries, 9 languages. There's 6-week training sessions where you go once a week. You have to sign up in groups of 10. The next one starts in February. And CUPE members in each of these different organizations around the province and their organizers and their trainers went through these sessions. You're trying to find, it's a model, it's not a tool, it's a method, and no one is saying this is new. And Jane McElvey is not trying to say, I invented this. These are going back to the ways that union members communicated with each other before we even had certification legislation, before we had any of this, when we were back to sit down strikes. But you consciously, with a plan, not spontaneously, organized to win power by finding and developing organic leaders, by learning how and when to talk to union members, by learning how to have conversations with skeptical union members, and by showing power to the employer and your own members by organizing what they call structured tests. So the first structured test that CUPE asked of its members was to sign a letter to the premier just after the provincial election where he got reelected, holy cow. They were getting ready to go to the table in early June. So they had a letter and a petition that would only be presented to the premier if a local reached a sufficient level of support. And this, yes, it's an online petition because they were trying to get members of the community to do it, but members had to actually put their signature on a document that was going to be on a huge thing. And Matt, maybe you can show the picture now, get rid of my face and see if you can, because it was hard for me to explain it, right? So see those things on the side, those are human signatures. Those are CUPE members who signed the document with the letter, and that's what was being presented. And so it wasn't just an anonymous thing. They actually had to put pen to paper and identify themselves as a particular local. And they did that. Okay, you can get rid of it now. They did that as part of a mass province-wide action on June 23rd, where each local that had been able to get the double majority of having this many people out of their bargaining unit signed this publicly to say, we're here and we support our bargaining team. We support our bargaining proposals. This is where we want to be. And then CUPE members also had tremendous outreach to the community by people attending community fairs and events all around the province during the summertime to support the petition. They were booked off members, they were handing out flyers, they were looking for more signatures on this letter and trying to get people to support it. And I know for personal experience that in rural Ontario, farmers, people who are working in these precarious jobs, it's primarily their wives and spouses who have jobs in the public sectors, hospitals, long-term care, school boards. Without their steady wages and their health benefits, these communities couldn't survive. And so it's a message that resonates when you get out of Toronto, which is why why the actual strike action in front of these local MPP offices was so divisive. It wasn't necessarily about how many people were in front of Queen's Park. It was about how many people were in Hawkesbury and Sault Ste. Marie and Cornwall, working people who may or may not have voted Tories, who were walking around just all happy with people honking on the day that they had their political protests. But anyway, but during the summer, the CUPE messages were very clear. It wasn't about wages. It was about funding required to increase staffing levels to make sure that every kindergarten class had a designated earlier childhood education. They talked about recruitment and retention. They talked about the need for public dollars to be put in maintenance. And so you can see local contractors going, oh, great, they're going to need more air filters or whatever it is. Maybe I'll get the contract, right? Like, you know, there's a symbiotic relationship between it. Anyway, I think I'm running out of time here. Of course, they had their next thing was to make sure that things were transparent and open in terms of the bargaining and the communication with members. I looked at every one of their bargaining bulletins. They had the actual proposals on the website. They gave no updates on what happened at every meeting that they had with the employer. And I could go through, and they even called it, you know how they call, the Tories call their legislation all these slimy names. Their proposals were called Proposals for Student Success and Good Jobs in Ontario's Publicly Funded Schools. Now that's a piece of legislation I could get behind, right? So, but this is a thing, like this is a demented thing, okay? Even though they have this whole level of structure of communications, as late as December 4th, they were putting on their Facebook page, it appears that not everybody has been receiving our updates. Unfortunately, we don't have full membership lists with your emails. We can only get them from locals who give them to us. Shout out for the locals who's given it to us. So if you're not getting it, please subscribe to us directly. Okay, so you have bureaucratic bullshit in the middle of trying to organize a new way of organizing where you can't even get your own members. Anyway, blah, blah, blah. They had video presentations with the CUPE economist and the CUPE researcher presenting why their wage proposals weren't causing inflation. This was available. It's a 36-minute YouTube video. You can find it and hear Dan Crow talk about like why this is trying to pay catch up for all of the things that go on. They had strike pay information about, well, will your health care benefits be paid? Will your pension benefits be paid? It's all the information was there in August as people are starting to make these decisions about what we're going to do. I'm going to passing. They had regional strike committees with committees that were trained about doing member contact and what were they going to do and how were they going to be preparing for things. And then it's just imagine this, you're a strike coordinator for the Upper Canada School Board, 12,000 square kilometers from Pakenham, just like west of Ottawa, Gananoque near Kingston to the Quebec border. Imagine being the organizer for trying to reach all that, but that's what they were doing. They have conciliation, things are not moving, there's nothing happening with the province, and then they go, okay, fine, we're going to have strike votes and let's see what we're going to do. Now there's some people who are saying that this move to online stuff is no good, you're using member combination involvement. Listen, people who have kids and who are working, they don't have time, they're not going to come to the membership meeting, but everybody's got time to listen to a video that's on tape that gives them all the instructions about what they need to do about voting. So they had a massive increase in their turnout for the strike vote. The percentage of who voted yes isn't as important as knowing that they had 45,000 members actually vote out of their 55,000. And of that, 82%, so of that people who voted, it was 96.5% in favor of strike action. If you set it as everybody who is eligible to vote, it's still 82.6%. I would be quite happy with an 82% strike vote, knowing that's what it was. The employer's response to that is make dramatic and substantial changes in your proposals. They weren't taking it seriously, even though I know from a friend, they were actually a bit freaked out about the percentage of people who voted. Then we go to mediation, there's this whole long thing about you ask for a no board report, you wait for conciliation, you have to give 5 days notice of whether you can strike, all of this other stuff. They're ending the process and on October 19th. And then on Sunday, October 30th, they get a call saying, we're not asking you back to the bargaining table, but we're telling you that we're holding a press conference. The premier is holding a press conference tomorrow morning on Monday, and we want to meet with you Sunday afternoon. And what they do is they say, this is what we're going to do tomorrow. You can take this or we're going to legislate it tomorrow. Of course, they said no, like how do you bargain with that, right? And so Monday, the government tables legislation to impose a 4-year contract. They're not going to send it to arbitration. They're not going to impose terms and conditions, and they're going to use the notwithstanding clause to say, even though we know what we're doing is violating your freedom of association under the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, we're going to do it anyway. This is the nuclear option, or as Harry called it, the declaration of class war. And so what happened? And Sam, in Sam Gindin, in his application, it says, I forgot. They also added 3 more concessionary things. They were not going to make sure that casual employees were changed differently, were paid differently. They were going to delete existing job security provisions and existing sick leave provisions. So thanks very much. We're going along. So the key question is, why did CUPE members not follow what's happened every other time the government does something like this? And obviously it's because the government overplayed its hand. They made a complete strategic error in using this bill to say that they were going to use the notwithstanding clause. And by this point, the members are saying, okay, in for a penny, in for a pound. You're going to do this for us anyway. We're pumped. We're ready to go. We're going out. It's not a strike. It's a political protest. The government didn't want to take a chance on arbitration because they know that interest arbitrators look at the economic situation. And you know that Sheila Block and the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives has done an absolutely phenomenal job of predicting that because the provincial government underestimates their revenues by at least $10 billion, they're going to actually have a surplus next spring. They're just lies, right? So But I think that CUPE members in and of themselves wouldn't have been willing to do the political protests on Friday the 4th, if they hadn't been doing this one-on-one conversations and building power and building confidence and building a sense of what their rights were and what the provincial government was trying to do to them. When you tell someone that they're going to have a $4,000 fine for showing up on a protest or a picket line illegally, and that's more than your monthly wage, you say, bring it. You can't get blood from a stone. I'm going off. I think if they'd made the fines $50 or $100, maybe people would have been more reluctant. But at $4,000, forget it. I'm going out of here, and I'm going with all of my coworkers. CUPE had said, by the way, we're going to pay your strike fines for you out of the strike fund. And OPSU, who didn't have a dog in the race, they have people who are in school boards, but they hadn't been to the bargaining table yet. JP Hornick, their newly elected leader, who also follows the organizing for power model, says, guess what? OPSU is going to pay the fine for you too, if you want to go out in solidarity on these political protests. And then you have, I'd love to have been the person in the room, but there's massive meetings with all of the union leaders in Ontario, private sector, public sector, saying what the hell's going to happen. And over the weekend, you're also getting rumors of a general strike. Also, just for you aficionados, the Ontario Labour Relations Board was holding live hearings for 16 hours on Saturday, and that restarted Sunday morning at 7 a.m. So you can just watch people from the government and watch the union side lawyers saying, no, this isn't an illegal strike. It's a political protest. Anyway, it was, I know friends of mine were glued to it that weekend. So the protests continue on Monday, November 7th, right? And then we find out the provincial government's going to have a press conference. What the hell is that about? 10 o'clock. Again, they're bargaining not with the union, they're bargaining with the public. And then they say, we're going to withdraw it as though it never happened. Sam's got a great quote from Doug Ford saying, I don't want to fight. I'm past the stage of fighting. Now I would like, that's so great to have him on his hind leg like that, to just say, you 55,000 people have made me walk back from this. So the press conference is CUPE's supposed to have one. They wanted one. What I'm thinking about is that they actually wanted to have it in writing, because nobody could understand what the blithering premier was trying to say about what he was doing. So they get something in writing, and this is where, I mean, if I was there now, like, I probably would have been advising something different, but I'm retired. I got 20/20 hindsight. I wouldn't have pulled down the picket lines. I would have said, fine, let's bargain today. You're in a legal protest anyway. You got everybody off the job anyway. They're all getting paid. Let's see what we can do till 5 o'clock on Monday and see if we get a better deal. I don't know, wasn't in the room. They don't, they pull off the picket lines as a gesture. They call it as a gesture of in good faith to the province for doing this. We'll pull off the picket lines. We'll get back to bargaining. Me personally, I think that took the oomph out of it, but workers were pumped. They really, really thought they won, and they did. They won something. They caused this legislation to be withdrawn as though it never existed. And that, I better just stop talking now. And then things start to go badly because they move away from their organizing model. They stop being transparent because the mediator, Bill Kaplan's back at the table saying he wants a blackout. They stop having video meetings. They stop having contact with the members. They stop reaching out to their local organizers about what was happening. And then they get a tentative agreement. Oh no, but although they do give another 5 days notice of strike, they don't just completely roll away. They say we're starting the 5-day strike, but on the eve of the 5-day strike, they actually get a tentative agreement on November 22nd, 21st in the middle of the night, this sort of thing, or maybe in the afternoon. And they start to have ratification meetings, many online seminars between November 23rd and December 3rd, multiple days, multiple times. I wasn't there. I hear people saying that lawyers were warning people and stuff like this, but I reject the notion that members can be led by the nose by lawyers who say, oh, you ought not to do this because it's fear mongering. I have personally been at membership meetings where I have been handed my ear on a plate by members who've rejected tentative agreements. Nurses in a Cape Breton church basement, 3902 meetings with 1,000 members on the convention center on Front Street saying, we don't want this tentative agreement, take it back. Local 2 electricians at the TTC have rejected tentative agreements, despite saying, oh, you're going to get in trouble. They just, if they don't like it, they're pissed. They won't take it, they'll reject it. So something happened in the mindset of the members between October 7th and when they actually are ratifying it. Because what ultimately happened, they had 41,559 members who actually voted, slightly less than those who had voted in the strike vote, but still, you know, a big chunk of the 55,000. And 73% of those members who voted accepted it, 27% rejected it. I mean, they get to do it, it's their contract. So was the air out of the balloon of the euphoria after having the premier walk back? Yes. Was the weather worse? Yes. Was Christmas getting closer? Yes. Was the mobilizing and the energy and the communication with the members gone by that time? Yes. Was it a better deal than what the premier was going to impose on October 31st? Absolutely. So that is a long time. Oh, what I would say is, after doing all of this stuff, is look at what happened with the construction trades in May and June of this year. Highly organized, they shut down the city, there's nothing happening. They were off, and their right to strike is even more regulated than anybody else's. Can you believe this? They can't go longer than 6 weeks. They have to go to arbitration after that. Who knew that was in the, I didn't know that. Maybe somebody's making it up. Anyway, they got 12.5% increases over 3 years in Toronto and 10% elsewhere. I don't know where keeping members would have been after 6 weeks on strike. Would they have been able to do it? Don't know. So the answer to this is they had a 10-month process of organizing for power. And their plan is that this is a 10-year process for organizing for power. It's not going to just happen like this. And so Sam's ultimate thing, and is the one that he just wrote a minute ago now, is if we can credit the pre-strike organizing done by education workers for their illegal walkout, the corollary should be that since labor as a whole has generally not done so much of this organized, could we have really pulled off a general strike without having done that work? And so just because you're optimistic about what those education workers did doesn't tell us how we would actually achieve it. And that was what I liked about it. And you have another example, 3906, and McMaster at McMaster, they had a 3-week strike. They just took a ratification. The details aren't open. I don't know what happened. And Oxford School Board members reached a tentative agreement just yesterday. And the other thing that probably not many of you know, Bill 124, that one that says that you could only get 1%, in the middle of all of this stuff, it's ruled unconstitutional. And U of T negotiated a collective agreement with one of their units, Unit 3, which is the sessional faculty, that blew the arse out of the 1%. They didn't, they could have said, oh, the employer's going to, or the province is going to appeal, whatever. I think members are pissed. I think employers are scared. And I think we occasionally have to, we have to take the strike out of the toolbox occasionally so that the employers don't think it's just a paper tiger. But you can't pull it out of the toolbox unless you've polished it and got members committed and ready and willing and able to do it. Otherwise, it's going to be rusty and it's not going to work. Thank you. I went way past my time. And it had nothing to do with Michael's fabulous book. Sorry.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Leanne. That was great. We're going to move on to the Q&A for about half an hour for people who want to continue on. But